So for tonight though, Joy is going to give a talk to you about, the joy of data, right? Which I realize now I should have called this event the Joy of Christmas, but I didn't. So if you have any questions, just approach me or Alvin or Johnny. And without further ado, Joy.
Hi everybody. So I want to start off with two things, and it's a really nice intimate crowd. So let's start with two basic things. Number one, this is very important. Thank you very much for your attention. Right? We live in a world today where attention is the most coveted resource. It could be time, money, but the fact that you're here, it's raining outside. Thank you. And I hope you learned something or take something valuable from here. But because you're giving me your attention, let's switch things up a little, right? I know there's a certain point after which you're going to tune off. So instead of me monologuing for 20, 25 minutes, how about we have a conversation, right? And I genuinely mean a conversation. So I'm going to tell you who I am, and then I'll ask you, I think, Dan, you kind of already did the who's in the audience, but at any point during the presentation, if you don't understand something, just raise your hand and say, hey Joy, I didn't get that, could you just go over it, right? And I'll make sure that we stay in time and all that. Does that work? Okay, cool. So let's start off with the most difficult part of the conversation, which is who am I? And yeah, it's difficult, right? Because a lot of people ask me this, and I think after a lot of thought, I'm genuinely aware of why I'm in this world, and the answer is food, right? I think if I could be close to food as much as possible during the entire time of my life, I'm very happy. And this is the only two pictures I found where I actually look happy and decent. So that's me. My name is Joy, but I've been also on the side based in data for the last 10 years. Worked with a few of these companies, as you can see, collaborated with some, was part of the organization. And I worked also with product teams for the last 10 years. And I noticed that there's two different camps when we talk about product and data. And they're usually very happy in their camps. There's not a lot of cross communication. And I thought, well, we kind of really work together, we need each other, so why don't we? And so that was the reason for finding the joy of data. You know, the creativity is really low on that one, but stick with me, right? So what we're gonna do today is just understand my experiences and what we've learned working with data teams and working with product teams. And at this point, I usually say, okay, who's the product manager? I think we saw there's a lot of product managers in the audience, a few developers. So with this sort of audience in mind, let's start off with the very basic question that I'm sure everybody asks, which is, how much data do product teams need, right? Because this comes up a lot, where people go like, yeah, but like how much exactly, right? Tell me where and what I need to collect to really do a good job. And I did kind of something cheeky, which I think a lot of you will recognize. I did pricing plans for no data, some data, lots of data, right? And on the left, usually doesn't happen. There's no data, there's no qualitative feedback, you don't have access to any data. All of the decisions you take are just by experience and intuition. It doesn't exist in the world we live today. Well, what's more realistic is the some data part, right? You have access to partial data, you don't have access to the platforms, it's a one-off. Whenever you need data, you request it from someone, and you get it, and then you start working with it, right? And the lots of data, of course, is everything. You have access to everything. Anything you need, you don't need to bother someone. It looks really great. I have a question. What do you think people, how do you think people react to this slide? What do you think people say when I show them this slide? Yeah? No? What do you think is the first impression when you see the slide? Go.
You want to try the thing in the middle, but the thing on the right is better.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's not better though. That's amazing, because when I show the slide, people go like, okay, I get it. I'll just go tell my data team I need access to my BI platform. Simple. Joy said lots of data is winning, right? And that's not technically true. And let me tell you what. What's really rather important is this thing called meaning, right? You can have all the data in the world, but if you're still confused, it's not helping, right? So So for us, we actually would love to provide more meaning to product teams and other stakeholder teams. And what this really looks like, it's just another word for insight and all those synonymistic terms. But look at what's happening now. In the no data side, you have insight, but there's so much more noise that's coming along with it that is actually hurting you than helping. Right? The middle one, same. What you really want to go towards is that there is always noise. There will always be some data sources that are not relevant for you, some dashboards that you don't really need to look at. And you want to maximize that. You want to go to a point where it's easy and intuitive for you to say, okay, I get it. This is what I was looking for. And I'm not hurt by the irrelevant dashboards and all the other insights. Does that make sense? You can say no, you can go like, no, that's bullshit. But if that even sort of starts to make sense, you should now be thinking, okay, so if this insight to noise ratio is really a relevant factor, how are we doing today, right? And that's really what we start with, is how good is that ratio today? So if you look at some studies, the way they did this at Microsoft was a simple split test where they monitored some features, but they ran it in a normal control way. And then the other ones, they just wanted to find out what percentage of ideas are actually delivering value back for whichever key metric I'm concerned with. And the answer is not that pretty. About 1/3. I love that. You know why? Because I'll show you why in the next slide. Because when I show this to someone, people go, yeah, it's startups, no? And it would be great if 1 out of 3 ideas would work, but it's not just startups. I mean, there are big organizations like Netflix that says 10%. 1 out of 10 ideas are delivering value, and everything else is just wasted effort. So is that good, bad? What do you guys think it is? Bad? Happy? Good? Good. Some people, she was very happy with 30%. Oh, she would take 30% on a bad day, right? I think it's not great. I don't think it's great because it's not the number that matters. It's about, at 10% you don't really know what you're doing. You're really fishing in the dark. And that's what I want to change, right? So a follow-up would be, what exactly are we missing here? Why are we at 10%? Or why do we feel happy at 30%? That's something we need to look at. And this is something a lot of you are familiar with, right? Is anybody not familiar with this? Simple way we design, let's say, a feature. We have a product strategy. We think about the metrics, design the features, and then the data. It's an oversimplification, yeah. Allow me that, but is that the full picture? You guys think? Is it missing anything? Sorry? Exactly. It's missing. Sorry? So let's say it's clubbed under the data, but I think you mentioned that what it's missing is the fact that it feeds back to strategy, right? Whatever the data says about the, like you said, user metrics, etc., should in an ideal world affect your strategy. Because what's the point of collecting data if it's just sitting there, right? And here the second piece is how often when we do this, let's say you went through this roadmap, you got some data and you sat down and go, okay, so this is what the user metric says. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just like for clarification, your definition and scope of strategy. Because strategy is like, everybody throws it around, right? Everybody has a strategy for everything. I have a beer drinking strategy, like after 9 p.m., you know?
Okay.
What's in this chart, just to make it clear, what's the scope of strategy?
It's how you design the feature, for example, right? And what specific points do you need to consider when doing the feature? Because the data will really feed into those specific points, right? That is a great question.
Yeah, so it's not like the business strategy,
No.
big product, it's very close to this.
It's a much
very,
smaller
very,
scope.
very
than
close
are we
scope.
drinking on Fridays or not? Absolutely,
Cool,
you're right.
thanks.
And what's important to realize is that we do this most of the time, but what we're not really doing most of the times is just measuring that insight to noise ratio. It means when we designed this workflow and we went to the data and the analytics said A, B, and C, Are we considering that we're only filtering out what's relevant and insightful for us? Or are we also then accompanied by a lot more noisy metrics? Thoughts? Okay, so if any questions on this, but now what we're going to do is we're going to move into where these issues sort of come from. Because I wanted to paint a picture of where we are sort of missing out some inefficiencies. But the real picture starts to develop when we think about, okay, let's move everything away. For lack of a better term, let's look at strategy as something that product is responsible for. I assume that's correct. And data is something that data people are responsible for, right? So before we start writing out prescriptions and say, do this and do that, why don't we ask people from both of these camps what's wrong, right? So we actually went ahead and did that. And Antonia is a product management consultant. We started working together just as a collaboration. I met her at Meetup and we realized we don't really have product data collaboration, so we started doing that. She asked, what's the toughest thing about working with data teams? Are they never available? Do they don't understand product? Do we not understand them? Others. Any guesses which is the leading culprit here? Which one would you guys say? Let's start with, they don't understand product. How many people feel that? Okay, all right, fair. How about they're never available? Yeah, that's a lot more, and that kind of makes sense. 48%, 1 out of 2 product people are upset that I would love to talk data and figure out what this particular insight, metric, strategy is doing. Just no one's here. Right? And I'll get to why actually, but let's go to the other camp and say, okay, so Joy asks, what's the biggest thing, what's the biggest pain point when working with product people? Are the objectives misaligned? Is there a lack of interest in data? Are we speaking different languages, barriers in communication? And I don't know if this is a surprising answer, but we feel that the objectives are grossly misaligned. Right? And again, it's not a surprise, but it also makes sense. If we're working on 2 different objectives, we're probably not there for you. Because we think something else needs to be prioritized while you're prioritizing something else. Right? So, with that in mind, let's just put it all together. We spoke to the 2 camps, never available, misaligned objectives. There's one other interesting thing that came up, that camp data doesn't enable us, which means we don't allow you to self-operate data for some reason. We always need you to have us with you when we help you out. No processes for collaboration. Data doesn't understand us. Lack of interest from camp. So at this point, what we can do is we can walk through how that really looks like. But do you guys have any additions or questions to those things? Yes, sir.
I'm just surprised why on that side is never ranking at the top.
I think because we went, if you go back.
Yeah, I understand. Why do you think that's the case? Because data teams are part of operations, right? So they should be available at the time when the operations are running.
That's a great question. So, do you want me to answer now, or do you want me to go through the slides? Because I think I didn't put them in the audience. I promise. But that's a great segue. So the answer, so like your question is, what's happening and why are they not available, right? So let's take an example. How many of you know what this is? It's a driver tree, metric tree, KPI tree for, I believe, an audio, right? So let's assume that we have a product team that's responsible for this, and they come to us and say, hey, FYI, let's say these are the data sources we sort of need to gather or start collecting, so that at some point, when we start tracking these, what we really want to care about is this North Star metric, like the weekly active users, for example, right? What's interesting is when you make that request, it seems like that is our only request and we should spend all our time on this. But in reality, that doesn't happen, right? In reality, what's happening is, as you can see, there's a lot more requests, which means that's what it looks like in reality to us. That your request is just part of the several requests that come from several different product teams. What that means is we don't treat it as a specific case of which needs our undivided attention. We have ownership, and there's an inherent priority, right? Because with all of this, the CEO or the COO can come in on Monday and say, hey, by the way, there's a board meeting, we need some dashboards, if you could just, whip that up, that would be great. So that's where that will also suffer. And if you kind of understand what all of this leads to, is that it leads to this wonderful place called backlog, right? We have your requests, and we will put it in there. It will just probably take you a few months to hear back from us, right? And this is where I came in and I said, okay, it's important that when I talk to product teams, I first understand how they work. And the way this would eventually end up is we would just give you the dashboard. You would ask for something, you would say, here's the access to the BI platform, Amplitude, Tableau, etc. Go nuts. And we've moved on to a different task, right? And as you can imagine, this is great to see, but it's a conversation starter. It's not the end goal, right? So, for example, what we would do is we would have these discovery workshops with product and data, and I wanted to figure out, because we don't have a metrics tree. We don't have a way of figuring out what the maturity level of utilization is, for example. So we came up with this sort of maturity model for the data framework in an organization. And it has a lot of parts, and I'm not going to get into it, but as you can see, the most critical pieces are organization, taxonomy, tools and processes, fluency, and utilization. And what does it do? It just tells you, in your organization, what's the state of data. Who's using it? Is it organized? Is it defined and has hierarchies? Are there specific tools and processes? Are people aware of what they're using? Is there fluency in the data, right? So here's the fun part, the answer to your question. When we go ahead and, with the example I showed you before, which is you get access to these dashboards, when we do the maturity model, this is what it kind of looks like, right? And if you start focusing into it, what's happening is, let's take Amplitude, for example. It's advertised as a tool for product managers, but there's a heavy entry barrier to it. You can't just plug and play Amplitude, right? So the data people have spent a lot of time on organization, taxonomy, set up the tools and processes, because the request was made that we need to see this in Amplitude. The problem is, when we give you this dashboard, you feel like that, right? Which is, we technically finished the job we were asked to do, but now you're left with the tool and data and insights that you really don't know, and you have to then start learning Amplitude before you can even start to use that insight. Which is why, when we ask the product side of the organization, they say, yeah, I don't really use it. And I'm not really sure what's happening, so I do other things. Yeah?
Fluency is basically like fluency in a language from the person using it, right?
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly. And tools and processes it's kind of a mixture, because tools and processes not only talk about the evolution of the BI platform or all of that, but also, are the product people aware of that tool, or is it just something shiny that data said, yeah, we need to use Amplitude from now? Yes, sir? Sorry, yeah. Go.
So, but don't people from data provide the actual clear dashboard to the product people, or that's the issue you're talking about?
In an ideal world, yes. In an ideal world, we would make it as intuitive and simple as possible, and I think it would be the case if we built this together as a unit. If you make a request that just says, I need to see weekly learning users, you will get weekly learning users. And we will move on to another request, which was probably some other KPI metric. So yeah, that's exactly right. We want to change that, and that's what we're talking about today. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I think I was going to say something relatively similar, and that is the idea that the two parties need to understand where each other are coming from and what they each need.
Absolutely.
So the data people need to understand how the product people are working, and the product people need to understand exactly what the data people need from them. So there needs to be a symbiotic relationship going on in order that they can actually create what is required.
Absolutely, and I think I love the word symbiotic, because that is the premise that doesn't exist today, right? Because if you think about, we were talking about this, if you think about the two parties in terms of what we enjoy more, data has a lot of power to implement and execute things. Product people have a lot of ownership, because they're running things, they're driving things.
Yeah.
But the perfect combination is a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
but we're usually separate, and so with all that power, it goes wasted. With all that ownership, you're not able to do what you want to do because, well, you don't know how to use that feature,
Yeah.
right?
And if you don't get to have that symbiotic relationship, you can end up with major dissatisfactions between the two groups.
Exactly. And if you think about the results, that leads to us never being there because this is not critical, right? It was a request, we answered the request, we moved on. And I'll get to one of the sort of tips, right, is to involve us sooner, for example. Then we can say, okay, we're building this together, right? But let's go into, I showed you one of these. I don't know if you guys understood, but I'll show you another one and try to guess what this organization is doing, because this will be a little bit more familiar. So organization is low, taxonomy is low, tools and processes are fine, utilization and fluency are very high. What could this be? Exactly, but what are people doing? Sorry, I can hear that. Not really. Let me tell you what, maybe, could be, essentially it's Excel sheets, right? So startup is a great example because when you're starting, you're just like, hey, just put it in an Excel sheet and we'll track that metric, we'll put that OKR there, it's all fine. And generally from a data side, it's really bad. It's really bad because it grows so quickly, right? That you don't always start with 5 data, like Excel sheets and say, okay, we'll stop when we're at 10, right? You compound that to a level that when we come in, it's really difficult to take that and then modularize it. Because from the beginning, that's not the goal of Excel or these, let's say, one-off ad hoc tools, right? So, and again, I'll skip over this really quickly, but the goal, like you guys talked about, is not just to see where we're doing poorly, but of course get better and better. And so when we do this workshop, we'll always enable people to run that every quarter. So like you can run it in Q1, and then you want to see, okay, are we doing better? Because as we run that, we will give you actionable steps to say, this is not great, this is not great, maybe focus on this. If you want your utilization to get better, right? That's sort of the goal of these maturity models and the conversation between product and data. Right, so at this point, and I think a lot of people a lot of people are really at this point, which is like, that's great, how? Because, I mean, sure, but how do we get there? And so let's talk about some simple things that we touched on, which was, yeah, first and foremost, let's stop being transactional, right? So I know discovery is a holy room that data people are not allowed in, but let's change that. I'm not sure how many people do this, but like, if the way I've seen most organizations do this is, if you look at discovery to feature launch, you start with discovery, then you go to the UX designer and you sort of half-bake this feature, whether it's a mock-up or a framework, and then you come to data and say, well, let's fill in the gaps, and this is what we want you to try. Is that accurate? What do you guys think? Is that not representative of what you've experienced? Because that's fine, but what usually happens is at this point when you come to data, that feature and all of the possibilities, like we talked about, is already half-baked, right? So our potential to help you / get ownership / treat it as a collaborative project is already ruined, right? So I would say a better practice that we've seen in organizations is they don't, I mean, of course, like discovery by itself makes sense, but as soon as you're sort of sure of what this is or the goal is, involve data sooner, right? And of course, like then you can do data-driven design and all of these things that are additional benefits, but the real benefit here is we understand from the very beginning the inception of what we're about to help you with, right? And with that brings a lot of not only familiarness, but also, okay, we understand what we're trying to do, and then this particular insight dashboard, etc., that I give you is just part of a bigger problem that we're trying to solve. So when you ask us, hey, by the way, we looked at this, we understand that we need to be there because then we don't just deliver and move on, right? Thoughts? How are we? Good? Yes?
Maybe I'm in my designer box, but isn't data also feeding discovery?
That's a very interesting question, and to be honest, I don't know, because at that point it's so infant that there is no data. It's more like evidence, right? Because when we start, let's say we want to build a simple app for ride sharing, there's no data, right? We can borrow other people's experiences and qualitative feedback, but that's it's more evidence to sort of guide you in a particular direction. For us, I think discovery is where you sort of crystallize that. So you go to a point where you say, okay, guys, look, the product team and maybe the business unit and the sales unit will figure out what we're building, right? And then they'll come to us. But usually what happens is that conversation is then succeeded by, okay, let's have a designer, mock it up to see how it really looks like. No? This is great. Yes, sir?
Mics, microphone. We can't hear people, so I'm going to start microphoning everyone.
Anyway, so at least what I learned about product discovery was always that the data is a part of it, and as I see it here, it's like a second, or in the idea world, it's a second step.
Right.
In the reality, it's a third step. To be honest, maybe I have a other bubble, but when I was doing product, and I'm doing it for 10 years now, data was always a significant part of it, because how should you decide on your product discovery on what to do without data? But it's not really going in my head, but maybe I'm from a different bubble there, but
no, I think you're right.
I would not underline it, like you said in the slide before, that it's like the third or fourth step of it. Yeah, so
to be honest, again, I don't know whether you've been part of smaller or bigger organizations, and that usually is a factor, right? Because in smaller organizations, yes, of course, in startups, there's a bit more cross-pollination between, hey, we're building this feature, and why don't we get together and help this out?
yeah, that could be definitely be the case, because I was 10 years in startups.
Sure, and I think, again, it's not to say that we never do this, but I think genuinely, if you look at the responsibility boundaries for data and product, we come into the room much later than the inception of the idea. And so I think you're right, this isn't, I'm sort of blowing out the problem to make you see like, oh, that's really bad. It's definitely not that bad, right? I'm sure on the second or third meeting of discovery, we come in, right? But the goal is rather to establish, I think again, going back to the symbiotic thing is, we do this together, and sure, we can have an early meeting, but the beginning of the project is when data comes in, when designers come in, and we then sort of go into our, this is my responsibility, that's your responsibility.
So definitely I'm on your side, because I think a crucial part of product discovery is looking at your data and see, okay, does it make sense or not? Yeah. So we're on the same page there.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I wonder how you get from this step from discovery to feature design with or from discovery to data without the feature design, because how I perceive it is you always have to do the step designing something,
Right.
and then get feedback data on that. Yeah.
But that's a good point, because I think if you remember what I mentioned is, at that point, I mean, data is kind of a pro-all blanket, but it doesn't have to be measurable, quantifiable data. And this is something that we are also open to, where when let's say we actually practice this get together from discovery, there is no bar that everything when we say data has to be a particular metric coming from analytics. It could also be qualitative feedback, user feedback that we get that then sort of drives that feature design, right? And so what would be nice, at least this is something on our side, is to help establish this ground rule that when we say data, don't immediately think dashboards, Excel sheets, etc. Right? Because you're like, oh, what do you mean? I'm designing. I don't have a design. I have a vague idea in my head. What am I going to track? Right? But what we are good at is always finding the closest quantitative number to your qualitative feedback. So if we sit in a room and you say, look, all the other apps do this, this is the friction point, we are really good at finding something that correlates to that qualitative feedback. So we'll figure that out, but it's not a dependency on your part. You don't need to come in and say, well, if I don't know a quantitative number, then I guess I can't talk to them, because they only care about that. I think you're right, we have a tendency to like that more, but given in that, I would rather work with product teams and say design units earlier and have amorphous, non or vague data than come in later, because then there's other issues that come in. if that makes sense. Did you have a question? Microphone? No?
Just expanding on the question previously. I mean, this looks a very linear scale of targeted where, but I mean, especially in the last 2 years, how do you actually strictly divide like discovery, data, and feature design, especially these three? Because they're all so like there's so much of correlations and forth and back. I mean, you could actually pick feature design and then come back to the data and then maybe do a discovery. So how do you, especially in these days, where this distinction is very, very in.
So I think you kind of answered the question, because this is not exactly what happens when you write, right? And I think we're all aware of that you can never have a linear progress on discovery, and we'll never go back to data or feature design. I think the point of this slide is rather say the cadence of why. That's why you see like the only thing in green is data. The pressing thing here is just make sure we're in the room, or we're starting the project as soon as possible. And of course, you're right. Like we can go back and forth, but that's not what we're saying. Is that you have to, once you go past feature design, you can never come back to data. That's fine. No, it's more about where, at what point of this life cycle are we getting in?
In this context, how do you define data?
It's tricky. It's very
Because isn't discovery data by definition?
It depends. It depends, because a lot of that is defined on the product team that's doing discovery, right? So I think you make a good point, which is maybe, and I think you were mentioning this, maybe people who are doing discovery already have that data-driven mindset, right? I think that would be a good metric, is to say whenever we do discovery, we always care about evidence and data. And if you have that, then of course you'll invite some other people and take their brains. But I think, yeah, I would then say a better marker would be, do you care about data? And are you actively looking for that when you do discovery? Because, again, to be honest, a lot of organizations are falling short of that mark, where they're coming, even being data-driven, before or like after they've sort of baked the feature. That makes sense. Questions? Okay, so let's move on to number 2. So number 2 is, and we talked about this, ask us to help you interpret the insights. Don't just ask us to give you access to that dashboard. And let's decompress a little bit, like the way we feel before and after feature release is kind of like that, right? Because before, yes, of course, like you're always interested in the latest, insight dashboard, all of the pieces that are moving around. The feature gets released and we're just hanging out chilling, right? And I can tell you why that is. Let's take an example. I actually took it from this. This is a great course, by the way. I'm not going to get into it, but let's look at this. You ask for a particular churn metric, we give you this, and you've moved on, right? So what it shows is there's 3 sort of aspects: person, the user searching the song, playing the song, sharing the song. And we used to say, hey, 2.6% conversion from search to share. Okay, sure. And for us, the way it seems is this is the end goal for you, right? Because you requested churn metrics, and we said, okay, you can see it now, you will keep updating as you go. What we're failing to realize, and this is really something we need to work on, is that's a conversation starter, because then you say, wait, that's great, but which user core is really dropping or staying? And then what's causing that friction for people to then play the song but never share with their friends, right? And this is something more for us if we understand. It's not like, and you mentioned this, like it's an ongoing process. So we deliver something, you have some questions, and we come back, and we keep doing this, like an iterative. Someone mentioned an iterative sort of process. Then it's helpful for both of us, because then whatever questions you ask here, for example, we will take in, and then the next time we'll probably have another metric or another dashboard that just shows you why they're dropping, right? And then it becomes something that actually delivers value to both parts of the organization. Yes, ma'am.
How can you tell the why behind it?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know this particular product, but I think the answer would be figure out why, like, what are those feature frictions that are causing people to not share? Or did you say about the not playing?
The why, because data, like quantitative data, is just how many,
Exactly.
and not tell me the why. The why would be the qualitative part
Exactly.
where we talk to users, or I don't know, like have on-site surveys.
Yeah, like NPS.
Get the right, because out of this data, I just have an assumption in mind, maybe why, and then I have to validate it, right?
Well, and I think that's a good point, because most of the times, if you look at the deliveries that come from our side, are usually not incomplete, but partial of the truth, like you said. You only see what's happening, you don't see why and what that is causing, right? And I think there is room for us actually sitting down and figuring out, we don't just need to know the quantitative number, but we also need to know a simple NPS, simple like user surveys, along with it, because that gives you the whole picture. This is just telling you partial picture. That answers your question.
But don't get me wrong, if you can tell me how I get the why, I would be happy, you know?
Yeah.
But isn't that the symbiosis between product and data? Data tells you what's happening, product tells you why. Or is that data's responsibility to say, this is how many users you aren't doing it, this is why? Or is data's role just to say, this is the data?
So one piece you're missing there is this, that doesn't happen synchronously, it happens asynchronously. So the same conversation we had happens over a period of weeks, because we will deliver something, and then you will use it, and then you'll come back to us, and we'll put it in as another request on the backlog, like, okay, figure out why that's happening.
You were data team.
Right, because this is, again, not the only thing we're working on. We haven't prioritized this as being P1. So what's important, the lesson to take away from that is, absolutely, if we're all doing this together as a team, as a unit, and having this conversation, the moment I show you this graph, you say, okay, so I have 3 questions, A, B, and C, and then we'll go home and sort of figure out these 3 questions, right? And I think that piece is missing because of the symbiosis or any of those factors, that if these cycles, because that will happen, right? I mean, in today, this is not going to die in its own. What's going to happen is the product team will make another request for, like, let's figure out why this is happening. Let's run some user surveys. The problem is that the cycle is so long that it's more painful than to just get this and get value out. Does that make sense? Yes?
I have a basic question. So how do you define a data team? Because like when you started talking, I was like thinking of data scientists, like using Power BI, and they're using just numbers, you know?
Yeah.
And now it's like getting blurry because like asking or answering the why, and then we're in the research, the user research part. We do a different kind of research and create different kind of data. But as data teams or data people, are those like qualitative research people too, or not?
So it depends, and again, this is a great point that you're even venturing into this, because that already alludes to so much that you don't know about the data side of the organization. But to give you a simple sort of division of, like you said, data science and analysts. Analysts are usually, according to one metric, they're looking at data that's already been gathered, right? So there's a lot of data, they need to make some sense of it, they'll give you that, right? So ideally, when you're working with feature design and you're building out these strategies, you have an analyst, because there will be a lot of data coming in, and you want someone to process that and put it into English language, right? You also need data scientists, because maybe, so at this point, the way this will happen is you will go through this, and the analyst will then go back and figure out workflows to understand the why of it, right? But then you might get some response that is still not modeled in the feature. That's where you need a data scientist to figure out, with the available Lego pieces we have, what can we design, what framework can we build that either makes us better or starts recording the pain point of that. Does that make sense? No? You can say no. It's not.
Processing.
Yeah, and I think that's another difficult part. Is
It sounds like to me you're describing this with the product operations team. Like, so when I've worked before, I'd like have the data team, and they'd be doing like general company stuff. They'd have the data engineers, they'd build the pipeline, work with the devs. And when we got to this stuff, I'm going to hire now my ops team.
Yep.
That kind of sounds like the domain you're really actually getting to.
That's a great point, because you'll see in one of the final slides I talk about, you know, who does this? The thing we're doing right now, who does that? And it's product ops, right? It's the closest body that I can think of that can still interact with data and product but not go super deep down to the Python notebook level, and not super deep down to the user design, right? So yeah, you're right. I think, and if you saw Antonia, the person who ran the poll, she's a product ops person. And this is why we got together, because we thought the simplest way to fit this into an organization is have a product ops team responsible for this, but also it then comes down into educating these camps. So the product people need to be aware, like, okay, I have recourse for doing this. The data people need to be aware of, okay, then these are not just requests, but this quarter we're focusing on, I don't know, feature X, and this is why these requests are coming in. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense, thank you.
Maybe we talk. Because it's, again, I wish it would be as easy.
What about the why? You know, how can you tell me the why if you just see numbers? You know,
I think that's the answer is that you can't.
Quantitative numbers, I mean, like
But-
how often, how many, you know.
No, I think you're right. I think the answer, like Dan said, you can't. The problem is when we get these requests, we usually stop at the what or
Okay,
the number,
totally fine.
right?
No, totally fine, because
Yeah.
you talked about the why, and I was like totally confused. How can you tell me the why?
No. I mean, to be honest, to answer why, we'd have to dive into that particular product and that particular feature. Because again, this is just an abstraction of the numbers you see. You don't see the feature, you don't see what it's part of.
This might be a bit of a sideball. Can you ever tell the why with data? Right? Because, so, okay, here's a controversial statement. I think, for the sake of argument, product teams can be data-driven. I find it harder to imagine a data team who's product-driven. Right? So a product team can look at data and tell you the quantitative data and then also tell you the why. But it looks like a data team can't do that second thing because they're like, oh, we delivered, then we moved on because you didn't ask. So that line you mentioned is getting blurry, right? I agree. I think it is. Like, where do you just define? If discovery isn't data, what's the data? Right? That's my question there.
But I think it's a good point. I mean, we can try, but we'll never, yeah, you're right, we'll never be product different because of a myriad of factors. But I don't think we're trying to even be that. What we're trying, and ideally for me, what would be great is if we have a relationship that's symbiotic, but also we understand that we enable you. It's not the other way around, right? Because we can build cool dashboards and cool stuff, and it will just be in a vacuum because either you don't need it or you don't really care about it. So, and again, the goal for me is to, of course, talk to both teams, but the underlying bedrock is always that product teams are building something that they could benefit from being data-driven. And you know, there's aspects that we can teach you, but you're not going to get into. Just like it's difficult to explain where the analytics and data science boundary falls. And that's where we say, yeah, but you know, don't worry, because we have these two team members, and their responsibility is to sort of deep dive, and we know what they're deep diving into. Because that's a more functional relationship than sending over requests, getting it, and then just saying, yeah, we're data-driven, but I don't know, you know? I'll just share something. Yeah?
So these platforms that aggregate all sorts of feedback, like support tickets and customer feedback, and then draw insights out of that, do you see that as falling in the domain of data or of product? Because I'm still confused about, I mean, it's because I understand completely what she's saying, and I'm wondering about the same thing. Because so much of it is, of the qualitative information goes to product. And then I'm just wondering, are you complementing that? Are you also analyzing that? Or, because it just seems like an organizational issue to me.
It is, and I think I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. And this is why, if you think about product ops, it's so new and it's so infant, because what they're trying to do is understand because then you can't have another space for product ops, product and data, right? You want to have one space that both people can access without the entry barrier of I don't understand BI or I'm not doing product roadmap, right? And so this is kind of the, it's a longer term goal because we're not even in the same room yet. I think you make a great point of like, okay, you've got us in the same room, we're working together. What do we do and what are the artifacts and where do I record those things?